Chapter 20 this week. The Easter chapter on Easter Sunday. Wonderful, huh? And we're going to try to cut this short a bit because we just witnessed 5 glorious baptisms. Wasn't that fantastic? Wow. So we're not going to be presenting the great reveal on bee leaf today. No, sorry. You were wondering about the great mystery on bee leaf. Wonderful mystery on bee leaf, but we're not going to pass bee leaf around either because these beliefs are going to be coming fast and furious. So here we go. And if you really want to understand an orderly course, a chronological events of this resurrection, then you have to refer back to Luke 24 that we covered previously. So we're just going to cover John here, and especially the difficulties regarding belief. Here we go. First off, the difficulty of scary Mary Magdalene. Yes, the chick that used to have 7 demons, as we read in Mark. Apparently going to the tomb in the dark, going sometime between a nautical dawn and a civil dawn, and finding Jesus gone already. Indicating that Jesus did not exactly pull off 3 whole days in the tomb, as suggested in John 2:19. Not even 3 part days. But that presumes that scary Mary actually got to the tomb before daybreak, that she got there before a civil dawn, when the center of the sun is 6 degrees above the horizon, when they can actually see. She got there, which is a 20-minute interval between nautical dawn and civil dawn. But once again, as indicated last lesson last week, there is an ambiguous term there, ambiguous grammar, that this was just the beginning of her morning journey, just the beginning of her glorious journey, just the beginning, since she had to hook up with the Spice Girls as well. Yes, she had to pick up that other Mary and Salome along the way to really spice things up. Yep, and that could have been quite a ways away. At which point, in their early morning journey, they could clearly see the stone rolled away without lanterns as the Romans used the previous night. It wasn't like there was an abundance of moon or stars there. And they could run without fear of falling and breaking a leg. And they could run to tell the disciples. So there was clearly a pretty good deal of daylight at that point. A pretty civil daylight. The 3rd part day. So no contradiction and no failed prophecy. Next, we have something that Calvin calls a seed of faith. With Peter and John now believing that this was not the end of the story for Jesus. With Peter and John being awakened from a carnal stupidity, as Calvin calls it. Not the end of the story for someone who could quite readily raise the dead. To think that this was merely assent to a belief that Jesus was taken, as per scary Mary, is simply silly, not worthy of mention. But worthy of mention was that this belief of John, at the very least, was generated by the headcloth, apparently, not by the sticky strips of linen that had surrounded the body. Rather, a headcloth which retained some form of wrapping, according to most other translations, which appears to have retained the recognizable form and position of a properly laid out Jesus. According to Barrett and Carson and Tenney, indicating something radically different than the body being roughly taken had occurred. Some sort of a beat me up, Father, had occurred. Anybody familiar with Star Trek here? No? Okay, so the modern day focus regarding this alleged shroud around the entire body is entirely irrelevant. We're talking about the headcloth here. This one-piece shroud that Rome supposedly had in 5 or 6 different places at the very time of Calvin, since it is strictly the headcloth on the slab that is relevant to John, causing John to believe, as previously claimed, to believe that Jesus was going back to the Father, as he mentioned in John 16:29. And even those angels in white, which later appeared on the stone slab to scary Mary, are only semi-relevant. They are just a blurry picture of those angels at the head and foot of the legendary ancient mercy seat. Yeah. A blurry picture for eyes loaded with tears, we read in verse 11. A similar excuse is given for her failure to recognize Jesus immediately. Although there is some wonky suggestion that Jesus was not recognizable at that point due to some uncanny shape-shifting abilities. Shape-shifting abilities like the Greek god Proteus, perhaps, or like a Marvel superhero, perhaps. Now, we do have that shape-shifting idea implied in Mark 16:12, however. But as Calvin admits, a radical morphing is simply not tenable for any stable-minded Jew, and should not be tenable for anyone outside of a comic. Like, would you walk several miles with a Martian along the Emmaus Road? Really? It's more likely that Jesus was wearing a veil or a cloak and carrying a cane of some sort when he was walking the Emmaus Road with Luke and Clopas. And that shape-shifting was certainly not the immediate concern of verse 17 either, where Jesus strangely resisted being held by scary Mary. Held by his feet. One of a handful of truly difficult passages in the New Testament, according to Carson. So, are you quizzers okay with merely a handful of difficult passages? Now, this is definitely not some silly concern of those now multiplied Spice Girls accidentally getting beamed up with him at that very moment. No. He knew he was going to be with them again for a little while yet. Remember that phrase? 3 days at the very least, if I'm understanding John 16:16 properly. So it is my chauvinist understanding that he was preparing those overly possessive Spice Girls for his ultimate beam up, directing their attention to a beam up which would occur some 40 days later. An anxious beaming up to be with his Father once again, a being with the Father that they should deeply consider as well. A beaming up that did not coincide with a cryptic breathing on the disciples that we read about in verse 22 that very night. Unlike the speculations of some theologians. A presumed breathing of the Holy Spirit on them. A presumed breathing with no immediate discernible effect. After all, our unemboldened disciples remained hiding out for yet another week. Here, Carson is strongly opposed to our NIV translation, insisting that this breathing on them is not a valid translation of the Greek word that you see written here. An emphatic word, somewhat associated with emphysema, chronic lung condition. Carson is partly opposed because Jesus insisted that the Holy Spirit would come only after Jesus had returned to the Father in John 16:7, giving disciples a certain boldness, and he simply did not return to the Father at that point. No form, no how. And partly because Carson regards Acts as totally authoritative, despite the low marks that others give it on the historical credibility scale. And Keener is really good in defending Acts. With the Holy Spirit properly manifesting in Acts 2:4, not our present chapter. With the number 3, the added grammatical support of there being no additional syntactical structure to carry the prepositional force of an in or an upon here. Something that is always there when needed. So it seems this breathing is best understood as a kind of acted parable, pointing forward to the full endowment yet to come. Now let me repeat that like a preacher. So make sure you get that. This is best understood as an acted breathing, simulating the sound of a very strong wind, perhaps, as per Acts 2:2. Pointing forward to a time when the disciples would have the balls to get out of their hideout and share the good news of forgiveness, as indicated in the subsequent verse here. Regardless, continuing in our primary vein of believing, we have the disciple Thomas believing in verse 28, or at least proceeding in a new integration of that belief, with doubting Thomas emphatically saying, "My Lord and my God," which is a declaration that Jehovah's Witnesses stupidly claim was just a vocative, "Oh my God." Stupid. Good grief. Good Jews don't say those sort of things. Jehovah's Witnesses believe John not. And that verse is supposed to be the climax of this gospel, according to Barrett. Huh? What an odd sense of climax. As if the climax hadn't occurred a good week earlier. Certainly Barrett believes, but by the skin of his scholarly teeth. Then we have a serious upbraiding of all the disciples, a severe criticism, along with a glorious lauding of all those in the future who will believe without seeing. Believe without seeing. Supposedly, they will see a greater reward than those supposed saints, those disciples that Rome loves to call saints. All these things were presented to us by the seriously upbraided John, presented in order that we might believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing we may have life. As regards Barrett's continued skepticism regarding the authorship of John, the authorship of John, the authorship of John. Yeah, skeptical of the authorship of John. In regards to that, Carson refers to someone called Raymond Brown in dismantling his arguments. Someone who wrote about 15 years later. An expert dismantling of his arguments. Ironically, Raymond Brown was a radical Catholic priest. And he also critically dismantled the Roman priesthood as well, while still remaining a priest. What an irony. Also, we have Carson using words like nonchalant and unusually stupid and slavish with respect to the skepticism of Barrett, saying that these skeptical claims are simply impossible to believe before breakfast. But let's get to the final dispute with the word belief in our final verse of this chapter. The final verse, which may be the original ending of the Gospel of John, with John 21 added by John afterwards, perhaps a generation later, just as John Mark appears to have added a chapter afterwards. A dispute over whether the final verse of this chapter means believe or whether it means continue to believe that you may have life. Of course, both translations are acceptable. But what is John's intent here? Naturally, Phil Comfort thinks that the true writing is continue to believe as per the earliest and best manuscripts, which are P66 Ionicus and Vaticanus. Whereas Carson thinks that it is merely believe, since that is the sense in which it is most often used in John, whereas it is used more often in the other sense in 1 John, which suggests a much later dating of 1 John. Later by probably a generation, when the evolved concern would be in retaining their fledgling belief. Oh, where do we have fledgling? Good old fledgling. Hey, fledgling, where are you? Their fledgling belief. Remember, the cute. Hey, honey, catch your fledgling. Oh. All right. So, their fledgling belief, when the concern would be a growing departure from a fleshly belief, we read in 1 John, from a touchy-feely belief to a mere mystical knowledge, to a distanced belief in some hypothetical angel called Jesus. What? We see that today. To a belief in something that merely had the form of a man. From a proper belief in a substitutionary blood and water that I tried to emphasize in our last chapter. To some fuzzy belief, fuzzy? Who, you? That only love is required. A false belief that doing justice, loving mercy, and walking humbly like an angel is all that's required. No. A belief that is overwhelmingly prevalent in our high society. A belief based on humanist works rather than a godly, finished work. A fatal belief. And along with Carson, that fuzzy humanism is pretty hard to believe on this side of the cross. Pretty hard to believe either before or after breakfast, since our daily works pretty terrible. Which brings us to yet another early morning in our final chapter that we get to present next week, likely. In our final chapter in the epilogue. It brings us to an early morning breakfast, or fishermen call it a shore lunch, where we see how pathetic our works truly are when we don't even know how to fish.